Hi, this is Sue Watkins. We will start in just one more minute. Hello, this is Sue Watkins, the Climate Change Program Manager with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals at Northern Arizona University. Thank you for joining the webinar. This webinar series is highlighting tribes and tribal organizations that have been addressing climate change impacts, and it also provides information about funding and technical resources that tribes can use. We are offering the webinars with support from the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, and in collaboration with the Forest Service, the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project at the University of Oregon, and the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative. This is the third webinar in this series. Today's webinar will focus on projects by the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, or CRITFC. And there's one more webinar on Wednesday this week, which will feature Kathy Lynn at the University of Oregon and me providing some information about funding and technical resources for tribes. This webinar is being recorded, and we plan to post the presentations and the webinar recording on ITEP's Climate Change Webinars webpage. Please type your questions into the question box on the right side of your screen. The presenters will answer questions following the two presentations. Following the webinar, you'll receive a link to a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to provide feedback and suggestions of topics for future webinars. And here's the contact information for me and for Christina Gonzalez-Maddox, who works with me in ITEP's Climate Change Program. ITEP's Climate Change Program offers climate change trainings, webinars, a tribal climate change newsletter, the Tribes and Climate Change website, and much more. We encourage you to visit our program website at the URL listed on this slide. And please feel free to contact us if you have any questions about ITEP. We are very pleased to have David Graves and Bob Heineth, as well as Sean Narum, with us for the webinar today. While we get up the presentation, which it looks like it's up now already, I'm going to introduce David and Bob, and then after they give their presentation, I'll introduce Sean, who will have a separate presentation. So David's work at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission includes GIS analysis, map making, database design, and research into the effects of climate change on Columbia Basin snowpack and streams. Before working at CRITFC, he spent 5 years performing fisheries data collection and management in Washington and Oregon. At Portland State University, his thesis focused on using GIS as a tool to model the potential effects of climate change on a local hydrologic basin. Bob Heineth has worked with Pacific Northwest tribes on fisheries and water management related issues for over 25 years. He retired from CRITFC in 2011 and since then has served as a technical consultant for CRITFC under the CRITFC Climate Change Project, focusing on climate change impacts to tribal first foods and adaptation strategies with the 15 Basin Columbia River Tribes Coalition. Primary areas of his attention include modernization of the Columbia River Water Treaty between the United States and Canada, development of the CRITFC information system, and serving as a technical advisor on the Willamette Basin 2100 Water Scarcity Project. He is also a fisheries consultant to select First Nations in British Columbia. And with that, I will turn it over to David and Bob.
Well, I'll start with a little bit on the background on the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, also known as CRITFC. Talk about a little of the work I've done looking at climate change impacts on snowpack and tributaries. And then Bob is going to talk about a lot of the work that he's doing looking at the main stem Columbia River and Snake Rivers, and also the Columbia River Treaty. And finally, Sean Naram's going to go over some of the research that his team at Hagerman Genetics Lab is doing on adaptation of salmon to climate change. This first slide right here shows some of the first foods that are of importance to the Columbia River tribes. First foods are important to all tribes, and in the Columbia Basin, the tribes traditionally follow a serving order at meals that starts with water, proceeds to salmon and fish, moves on to game, and then finishes with roots and berries. Eric Quimps, tribal leader at the Umatilla tribe, has encapsulated the first foods vision and a lot of the work they do in watershed restoration planning, focusing on water first, and with the vision that we need to take care of foods that take care of us. The CRITFC tribes are the Yakima in Washington, the Warm Springs in Umatilla in Oregon, and the Nez Perce in Idaho. And in 1855, these tribes negotiated with the federal government the rights to harvest fish and game and roots and berries in their homeland. This is the law of the land, these treaties that still stand. But it's important to note that these treaties were negotiated before a lot of the impacts that occurred to salmon, including a very extensive hydropower system. And some of the current impacts include climate change. So the treaty didn't really foresee all these impacts that have come on these first foods. CRITFC was formed in 1977 after a series of tribal victories in court. And in these victories, the tribes gained rights to be co-managers of the fishery resources. The mission statement of CRITFC is on the screen: to ensure a unified voice in the overall management of the fishery resources, and as managers to protect reserved treaty rights through the exercise of the inherent sovereign powers of the tribes. This slide just shows a quick view of the Columbia Basin for those that are not familiar. It's a very large area that extends up into Canada, includes portions of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, even a little bit of Nevada. And you can just see the scale of it. It's the size of several states, or about the size of Texas or France. So a very large area, 165 million acres in all. And so the next map shows the locations of the CRITFC's member tribes. Those are shown in dark, they're reservation areas. But in the lighter color are their ceded lands, and these are the areas where they have the rights to hunt and fish according to those treaties. So these ceded areas cover over 66,000 square miles, more than a quarter of the entire Columbia River Basin. But over half of the rivers and streams that are still accessible to salmon are in these areas. A lot of the traditional, or the historic salmon habitat is blocked by hydropower dams on the Columbia and Snake. So the remaining area is a lot smaller than it would used to be because of this. This next graph just shows a quick shot of salmon decline over time. There have been several impacts on salmon that have reduced their historic numbers, which are believed to be as high as 34 million fish returning per year, down to a current level below 2 million fish. These include overfishing in the early days, as I mentioned, the construction of dams and extensive hydropower system, habitat degradation, and other impacts such as water quality and contemporary concerns like climate change. And you can see in the very recent times some of the numbers have increased, have been coming back, so this is very encouraging. And the tribes are very involved with habitat restoration efforts and other efforts to return salmon. Waikanashmi-Wikishwit is a salmon restoration plan that was originally written in 1995 by CRITFC and its member tribes. And it includes a number of technical and policy recommendations and goals, including 4 million salmon returning by 2020. And this is on the CRITFC website and was just updated last year. So we're very proud of this here at CRITFC and the work that our tribes are doing in the vein of this restoration plan. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about climate change and some of the impacts that will probably occur on tribal resources because of climate change. So starting off, this is a graph that a lot of people might have seen some representation of in one way or the other. But this is just looking at the anticipated increase in air temperatures in the Northwest into the future. And you can see as you get out, there's a lot more uncertainty over what might occur. There's two main scenarios that are shown here as bookends. One is the 8.5, which is sort of a business as usual. If the human race keeps on burning fossil fuels like we have and using resources, these are the projections of what the increases in temperature will be by the end of the century. So very scary numbers. The lower end, the 4.5, is more of a drastic changing of society if we start to switch to alternate fuels and cut down on greenhouse gas emissions. Where the models show we might end up. Still increasing air temperatures, but a much more optimistic future that may be more manageable. So I think the key thing here is we don't really know where we're going to be. Like we don't have control over this except as individuals. So as fisheries managers, we have to plan for a future that's definitely going to be warmer. We just don't know what that actual number is going to be and what some of those impacts, how they might occur. We try to assess as best we can what they might be. In the Northwest, one of the main impacts is going to be to our hydrology. A lot of the models, or most of the models, actually show increasing precipitation in the Northwest on an annual basis, which would mean increasing flows. So that the impacts aren't so much to the annual discharge in our rivers, but more to seasonal discharge. And this is mainly a result of watersheds in our mountains that will switch from snowfall-dominated to rainfall-dominated, which consequently will change the timing of runoff, which is very important to salmon and other uses in the basin. This map right here shows some work we did a few years ago looking at what the winter temperatures are across the Northwest and in the tribal seeded areas. And the main takeaway from this is that the areas that are probably most impacted are those that are historically or in the recent history were right around freezing or just below freezing during the winter, meaning that those watersheds receive most of their precipitation in the winter as snowpack. And so with climate change, we're expecting warming, which is going to switch those areas from snowfall-dominated to rainfall-dominated. And so these areas will see a lot earlier runoff, more flooding in the winter, and less runoff during the summer. And so on this map, those areas in yellow are the areas in the near term that are probably going to see this switch happen in the tri-state area and the Columbia Basin. And the gray boundaries juxtapose the tribal seeded areas on that. So you can see a lot of the tribal seeded areas are in this very vulnerable area. And these are the watersheds that feed the streams and rivers where salmon and other cold water fish return and live. So this is of great importance to the tribes. Just looking a little bit closer at one of the basins, this is the Yakima River up in central Washington. And you can see kind of the same story. There's not really that much really cold area. There are mountains that fringe the basin in the west and the north, but they don't get all that cold in the winter. So with a few degrees of warming, a lot of that's going to switch to rainfall. So this basin is very much of concern for this impact. And this is just to look at the available water, sort of a precursor to a hydrograph from this, looking at this that we came up with. So shown in blue is the late 20th century where you see traditionally a spring freshet where there's a peak in flow from all the snowmelt that occurs around April or May and goes down through the basin. And then proceeding in the future, looking at some of the projected changes in climate, green is around the 2020s, yellow is around the 2040s, and red is around the 2080s. And this is what we see in a lot of the anticipated effects on the hydrographs across our areas, that we start to see less flow coming out in the spring and summer and more coming out in the fall and winter. So basically more flooding in the fall and winter and less when water is really needed for fish and other uses like agriculture and hydropower during the warmer months. Some of the tributary effects on salmon and steelhead from this that we anticipate are increasing frequency and severity of winter flooding, which would occur on eggs and overwintering juveniles. Lower flows during the summer, which would affect migrating and spawning adults, and also juveniles that are that have a stream-type life history. And of great importance is higher water temperatures. Of course, salmon are cold water fish, and their survival is very closely tied to the temperature of the water. And so with less flow and higher air temperatures, we can definitely expect higher water temperatures in the streams and rivers, which will stress not only migrating adults, but it might also disrupt the growth and downstream migration of juveniles. At CRITFC, we've done some investigations of water temperature over the last few years. In 2010, 2011, we cooperated with a study with the U.S. Geological Survey looking at effects on steelhead in the Yakima River Basin, and modeled water temperature in the Sadis and Toppenish watersheds, which are the most productive steelhead watersheds in that basin. In 2011, 2012, in cooperation with the Habitat Project here, we looked at water temperatures into the future in the Upper Grand Ronde River Basin in northeast Oregon. And over the last couple of years, we looked at the Clearwater River Basin in central Idaho. So I'll go over some of these really quick. This is a really crazy-looking graph, but this is what came out of a workshop that we did with the USGS up in the Yakima Basin. And so there were a group of stakeholders that got together and looked at all the different connections and impacts that occur in the basin. It's a very complicated basin. And also at some of the tribal interests in this area and how these are related to climate change. So came up with a conceptual model in the basin that informed a series of research papers that we did together on that basin. These are all published in an issue of Climatic Change last spring. So if you want to look those up, the journal is Climatic Change. Here at CRITFC, as I mentioned, we looked at tributary temperature modeling in the Sadis and Toppenish watersheds, which are shown right here. And so in this basin, we ran a couple scenarios along with the USGS team looking at 1 degree Celsius warming and 2 degrees Celsius warming in the spring and summer months. And one of the things we looked at was that thermal blockages tend to occur to salmon and steelhead at 22 degrees Celsius and above. So for some of the results, for example, in Sadis watershed, in the early 2000s, these temperatures occurred about 9 days out of the year. But with 1 degree of warming, which is in line with about projections about 30 years out, these were slated to occur about 17 days a year. With 2 degrees of warming, that was up to about 28 days per year. So definitely increase in those high temperatures that are detrimental to salmon passage and survival. In the Upper Grand Ronde River Basin, we were able to use a lot of temperature logger data that our crew has collected out there, along with what's called FLIR data, which is produced by flying the streams and rivers with an infrared device to get a water temperature profile. So we fed all that into a model called Heat Source, and these are the modeled stream reaches that we looked at in that area. These are basically the stream reaches that are used by Chinook in this basin. And this is just looking at the simulated mean temperature. These are August temperatures, so late summer when the temperatures tend to be highest. Looking at the simulated mean temperature in these areas and the simulated maximum temperature in these areas. And you can see that progression going forward in the future. The blue line is a little bit more a higher emission standard or scenario, and then the red one's a little more moderate. So these directly correlate to the graph I showed earlier with the air temperatures. But in both, you can see that steep increase in water temperature in these areas. This is looking at just on a map basin, looking at water temperatures above 23 degrees Celsius and below 23 degrees Celsius for the mean daily maximum water temperature in August. So this is looking at 2010, and then moving on into 2020s, you can see that red area starting to expand, 2040s, and then finally 2080s. So definitely a lot more stream reaches hitting that high temperature on a regular basis in those future scenarios. And then finally, here's a look at the Clearwater River Basin, which we looked at last year and the year before. And so in this area, we developed statistical regression water temperature models for all the different catchments of the watersheds in that basin. We used data from Norwest, which is out of U.S. National Forest Boise Aquatic Sciences Lab, and also data from University of Washington Climate Impacts Group and SNOWTEL and USGS sites in order to simulate, again, August temperatures in the future in these basins. And I'm not going to show too many maps. I just wanted to show this one right here. So this is looking at high water temperatures in the latter part of the 21st century, basically August temperatures, mean temperatures that are 19 degrees Celsius above, and stream reaches that are used by steelhead or Chinook. So it's a large part of their habitat is at risk for that, and we took a look at that. And so all these reports are on the CRITFC website under our technical reports section if anyone's interested in downloading them, or I'd be happy to answer questions or pass those on to anybody. The last thing I wanted to mention is that in cooperation with one of our research scientists here, our current project is to look at climate change impacts on Pacific lamprey and eulachon. So we're very interested to see some of the results from this study, which are a little bit different than the work we've been doing traditionally on salmon and steelhead. And so next I'm going to pass it on to Bob Heineth. So I'll switch it over here in just one moment, please.
Just a moment. Good morning or good afternoon. This is Bob Heineth with the Intertribal Fish Commission, and I'm going to be talking about a little bit of a different project and task as part of our overall project, and that is concentrating on main stem river operations. The Columbia River has over 50 large dams that are operated primarily for hydropower and flood control. But I guess before we do that, you're seeing a slide right now just generally talking about the trends we're seeing from the global climate models that are being downscaled for the Pacific Northwest, and then hydrological models that are developed from those downscaled projections. So as David was saying before, we don't know exactly what this is going to mean in the future, but in general we're going to see trends of increasing summer temperatures and lower flows during the summer period with a lot less snowpack, particularly in the mid-elevation ranges. We're already seeing that a lot this winter. Actually, it's been in the 60-degree range for the last 10 days here in Portland, and there's very, very little snowpack this year at the mid-range elevations, which is going to be a real concern as we head into the spring and the summer period. We're also going to see more what we call atmospheric river events, where we have so-called pineapple expresses coming in from the ocean that are going to be targeting specific areas and dropping a lot of precipitation on focal areas. Sometimes we've seen up to 12 inches in a 24-hour period in certain areas. So we're going to see lots more extremes, lots more and longer droughts, probably successive droughts, and more inundation and erosion of our watersheds here in the Northwest. So this is sort of a graph. It's somewhat complicated, but I think the main takeaway message here is we have a bunch of impact drivers that are both climate-based and also non-climate-based. And we already have a very stressed system out here. We have 13 species listed under the Endangered Species Act. It doesn't look like any of them are headed to recovery anywhere, at least in the near future. And then on top of that, we have this additional stressor of climate change. And that affects a bunch of other metrics such as water temperature, flow and timing, and then there are consequences to a host of important river users on in the system, both from hydropower and flood control and recreation and water supply, also navigation, but also something, as I'm going to talk about here just shortly, is the importance of ecosystem function and keeping ecosystems tied together so that they can continue to provide for protection and enhancement of tribal first foods. And so we need to come up with adaptation strategies to address these different vulnerabilities. And when we're talking about the main stem river operations, we're talking about changing rule curves for reservoirs, structural changes at dams, doing a better job forecasting, more accurate and more frequent forecasting, So we're doing a better job in terms of storing and managing our water, and also coming up with recovery strategies such as biological pinions. So first thing we needed to do is to put together a bunch of information. And so we've been collaborating with a host of different folks, both in the regional and national level. We held an international forum on climate change, looking at different models. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then with all this information, what we are doing is we're building a very, very complex hydro regulation model where we can look at a bunch of different river operation scenarios, and within the confines of flood risk and hydropower, we're developing what we call ecosystem scenarios that will promote and protect fishery resources and wildlife and so forth, other resources into the future. So I'm not going to go through each one of these bullets, but this pretty much summarizes the workshop we had about a year ago. We gathered some of the most renowned climate and hydrological scientists in the region and the nation, and we were able to pull in a bunch of the Canadian scientists. We sat down and we basically explored the different modeling techniques people are using to take the global climate models and end up with hydrological data sets that in turn run other models. And so we talked about comparing the different methods and pros and cons and so forth, and we're going to continue that effort. And as you see, we got a whole wonderful list of acronyms in the last bullet there, but these are all regional agencies, both the United States and in Canada, and we're going to continue this work. So putting together our model, we call this the CRITFC Information System Model, and we can, again, it's a very, very complex model. It's an access database model. We can look at different metrics, look at different climate scenarios, overlay different river operations and so forth from a host of many, many sites. We have over 100 basin river index sites we're working with. We can look at each one of these sites and determine what the hydrograph will be, and then in turn start to look at temperature under climate change and other vulnerabilities to fish and wildlife. So this is a map of the Columbia River Basin. I want to point out, let's see. Under the Columbia River Treaty, there were 3 very large projects and dams and reservoirs built. 2 of them are up in Canada. There's one Revelstoke, and also Mica, and also in the U.S. Libby. And these were built really to provide flood control benefits to Portland and Vancouver in the lower Columbia, but also the operation of those projects has a lot to do with maximizing hydro generation for the entire system. So the overall ability to store in the Columbia is much less than, say, the Missouri, but it still can, in an average water year, can hold back about 20% of the water and reshape that water for those 2 purposes. But in doing that, it's had a negative effect on ecosystem function and tribal first foods. So these are some of the model inputs that go into our CIS model. We basically use as a foundation the Bonneville Power Administration hydro regulation model that has 70 and 80-year historical flows as a basis. We've been using so far the Corps of Engineers flood risk rule curves because the tribes don't want to flood out Portland and Vancouver. But within those constraints, we've developed our own ecosystem rule curves to do a better job in terms of protecting fish habitat and increasing productivity. Other model inputs are the biological opinions in the Columbia Basin, energy considerations such as the Pacific Northwest Coordination Act, Canadian Columbia River Treaty operations, and over 100 climate data sets from the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group that were used in the treaty review and other regional processes. So this is an arrow diagram showing very generally how the data is treated and ends up finally in our CRITFC information system. We start out with global climate model scenarios. Those are downscaled into regional climate scenarios. There's bias correction, which is a process where you take a look at historical data and you make sure that what you're coming up in the downscaling regionally fits into those data parameters. Then hydrologic models are developed, either dynamic or statistical models. There's flow routing done, more bias correction and model calibration. And finally, we have a data set that we enter into our CRITFC information system. This next slide is a picture. You can see this is one of the hydrological models called the Variable Infiltration Capacity Model, or VIC, very commonly used by a number of different people. You can see there's a whole bunch of different metrics that go into calculating hydrology. It's not just stream flow, but there's also soil moisture, evaporation, radiant energy fixes, and a host of other parameters that go into that. This next slide shows some of the salmon and steelhead fish survival relationships that we are already beginning to enter into our CIS model, so we can start to look at salmon survival and productivity, chiefly based by migration, timing, and success of these fish as they move through the hydro system. And we know that the faster the fish are able to get down to the estuary and into the near ocean, the higher their survivals will be. So getting them quickly through the reservoirs and over the dams, particularly using dam spill, are very advantageous in that, and we are able to enter all these parameters into the model. So the outputs of the model in general are hydrographs at a number of basin dams, reservoir elevations behind those dams, looking at flood risk, basically determining what the flood risk might be, hydrogeneration, and then fish impact metrics. And we have what we call a GUI, or a graphical user interface, that once the data is created, we can basically very quickly put it into figures or tables for analysis and comparison. So in general, this is the way our model works. It gets a little weedy, but we have a series of database libraries. Basically, the user can go and pick whatever scenario they might want in terms of flows over the historical range. Then we basically use tools or modules that are software that are integrated into the model. We pick those, and then finally we go in and use the GUI. And these are the different types of parameters that go into each one of the models. So as you can see, the one I just pulled up, we have a number of different submodels we're attempting to integrate into it. Water temperature is one, fish passage survival I talked about. Also moving to a daily hydroregulation data set, and then working with the core in terms of a ResSim, the ResSim volume forecasting flood risk model. And then the graphic user interface, and then finally we create a series of graphs. And this is what the screen looks like when you first start in, and you start basically at the top left-hand corner and work your way down and select what you want in terms of a scenario, and then you go to the right-hand side and pick whatever application you want. And this is a close-up of the first layers of data that one has a choice of what they want to pick out, and the different steps that you would go through to pick out running a model scenario. And here's a close-up of the different software applications within the model and the sequence of that. So here are some of the graphical outputs using some of the University of Washington SIG data. During the Columbia River Treaty Review, which was a 2.5-year review of what folks thought what might be needed in terms of modernizing the Columbia River Treaty, we looked at a series of climate change scenarios and overlaid possible future river operations with those climate change scenarios. And this is the sort of output we have at some of the different sites up in Canada. Starting on the left-hand corner here is Micah, looking at different elevations for different river operations. The red in these graphs is usually the current condition, and you should see under climate change, there's going to be a lot less water, so there's going to be a need for drawing down those reservoirs more. And then moving on to Arrow Lake, which is the second large Canadian reservoir. This again, looking at reservoir elevations. Grand Coulee, and then looking at flows at the Dalles from the different scenarios. Here's a next one is an example of total generation at the BC hydro plants under these different operations. And then finally, in the lower right-hand corner, generation from the United States hydro plants under these different scenarios. And again, here's another example looking at 2040 under a dry climate scenario versus the current river operations, current again in red. And you can see how much this is river elevations in the reservoir at Grand Coulee. You can see how much lower due to climate change, very dry year, how much more the Grand Coulee is pulled down in order to provide hydropower generation, and then the differences in some of the outflows of the Dalles between the current condition in red and the blue or gray line, which the model scenario for climate change. So what we could do with our model is let's take a climate scenario and adjust it for our ecosystem rule curve so that we are basically doing an adaptation to the climate hydrology. And here's an example of that at Grand Coulee. The green is our ecosystem adjusted curve. The red is the current condition, and the yellow is an ecosystem curve not modified or adjusted for climate change. And you can see the differences in those. You see how much more Grand Coulee is drafted down. And what we're attempting to do is to keep the reservoirs fuller and use the reservoir storage to recreate, and enhance a spring peaking hydrograph for salmon. The other side, you can see that we're able to, the green line, we're able to do a much better job in terms of a peaking hydrograph at the Dalles than either under the current condition with red or the yellow, which is the ecosystem function that hasn't been adjusted for the climate change. So our next steps with our model, again, we're trying to get the most robust information in terms of the climate modeling. We just attended a 2-day workshop with a bunch of climate scientists and hydrological scientists, and folks are taking the latest, what we're calling the CMIP-5, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project 5 global climate information, downscaling that, and creating new hydrological data sets that are more robust than the ones we have currently. We need to continue to work with other regional entities, Bonneville Power Corps, Northwest Power Conservation Council, Bureau of Reclamation, among others, to improve the capacity of our model. We're working on integrating a water temperature submodel and fish survival models, and then we're beginning to work on putting together a report of our model for publication in the peer-reviewed literature. And then lastly, using our model, once we were able to do a good job estimating vulnerabilities, begin to look at some adaptation strategies for the main stem for tribal first foods. So moving on to the Columbia River Treaty, Water Treaty between the United States and Canada. It was signed in 1964 for 60 years. It does not expire in 2024, which is the end of 60 years, but it changes in that the United States has to start paying for flood control storage up in the Canadian reservoirs. The two purposes back in 1964 were just flood control and hydrogeneration. There was no consideration of ecosystem function or tribal resources. As of 2014, last year, either country now can send the other notice that they want to, if they want to terminate the treaty within 10 years. The flood control storage provision still continues on even if the treaty is terminated. And at the end of 2013, the United States sent a regional recommendation to the United States State Department saying that the treaty needed to be modernized by adding ecosystem function and also addressing climate change adaptation. So in 2010, 15 of the basin tribes came together, historical coming together to address the issues of the Columbia River Treaty and to get ecosystem function basically as a third leg of the stool along with flood risk and hydropower. With respect to ecosystem function, some of the main issues of that are noted in this slide. Restoring, preserving tribal natural cultural resources, recreating the spring freshets, minimizing drawdowns at upper reservoirs to protect tribal resources, and also to restore fish passage, all historical locations, which means up into the Canadian portion of the basin. This is a slide created by the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, and it shows a progression of the change, as David was mentioning, from a snow-based basin transitioning into more of a rain-dominant basin. And as you can see, historically, there was quite a bit of snow, particularly in the Snake portion of the basin, and in Canada, and also the North Cascades in Washington State. But as you move through time, due to climate change and warming, that snowpack is lost. And you see as you move from the 2020s to the 2040s to the 2080s, the only real snow-dominant portion of the basin left is in British Columbia. So that is why the tribes are thinking as an adaptation strategy to hang on to salmon. It's going to be important to get them up into those snow-dominated portions of the basin. And so the tribes are working really hard to restore salmon by getting passage over Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee Dam into the Canadian portion of the basin. Here's some climate modeling done with our CIS for the treaty, and this is basically to a wet scenario, which is the green line, and a dry scenario for climate change, which is the yellow, and it sort of bounds the current condition in red, and also a base condition run in black. You can see some of the differences there. Some of the metrics we can do with our CIS I talked about before. We used it for the treaty review. We could calculate the percentage of time that the salmon biological opinion flow objectives were met or not met. And I think the takeaway message of this table is that under the climate scenario we looked at, the metric, the flows could not be met in any of the 14 low water years. Right now we're meeting them in about 21% of those water years. So that's a concern. So moving ahead to some of our overall objectives, we continue to support advancement, again, of better forecasting techniques, better and more robust information, monitoring and promoting public awareness of what's happening in the basin with respect to climate change, research and adaptation planning, developing and implementing quantitative, qualitative frameworks to look at climate change impacts, and continue collaboration with others, both regionally and nationally, to promote these objectives. Some of the key areas we continue to work on are looking at the impacts of climate change on the three big drivers for the river in terms of river operation, ecosystem function, flood risk, and hydrogeneration, both for the treaty and the non-treaty. What the non-treaty is additional storage space that was created up above and beyond what the treaty basically did. That's about 5 million acre-feet of additional storage, and we would like to be able to shape that for ecosystem function as well as the Columbia River Treaty water. We also need to begin to integrate climate change adaptation into Columbia River Treaty CRT assured operating plans beginning soon. And with that, in that respect, the tribes would like a seat at the table. Right now, all the planning and operation is done by the United States entity, which is the Corps of Engineers and Bonneville Power. And on the Canadian side, it's British Columbia Hydro. So there's really no interest for ecosystem function sitting on the current operating committee for the treaty, and the tribes would like to get a seat at the table to be able to promote ecosystem function. And then finally, moving ahead, as I explained, with these vulnerabilities, analyzing the vulnerabilities, and begin to look at adaptation and working with our member tribes on some of those adaptation measures. So here's a slide of two dams in the system. One is Dvorak in the Clearwater in the Snake River Basin. The other is Round Butte on the Deschutes River. And they're both on tribal reservations, and they both have the capacity to withdraw cooler wet water at lower elevations to provide for temperature control when the river temperatures below the dam get too warm. So it's a possibility of an adaptation strategy for the main stem. So here is our contact information. David Graves, myself, Bob Heineth, and Laura Gebhardt, who is our project manager. And with that, I'm finished, and I'd be glad to turn it over to Sean.
Okay, thank you, David and Bob. And if anyone has any questions, please type your questions into the question box. Now I'd like to introduce Sean Narum. Sean is the lead geneticist for CRITFC and runs the genetics laboratory based in Hagerman, Idaho. His research includes three main themes, including genetic adaptation to environmental features, genetic monitoring of fisheries, and evaluating genetic effects of hatchery practices. Much of this research is facilitated by recent advances in molecular technology, including single nucleotide polymorphism, genotyping, and next-generation sequencing equipment available at the Hagerman Genetics Laboratory. Sean, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So this is Sean Narum. I'm also with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, but I'm based out of a laboratory that's in Hagerman, Idaho, which is a separate facility than where David and Bob have been talking to you from. And today I'm going to transition the talk into discussing more about the potential adaptation of salmonids to climate change. And I'm going to start off by showing a slide that shows a satellite image of the Pacific Northwest that's trying to emphasize some of the diverse environments in this region. And I'm going to emphasize the Cascade Mountain Range here by this dashed line. And when we look to the west of the Cascade Mountain crest, we see these fairly green, lush environments. However, when we move to the interior portion of the Columbia River Basin on the east side of the Cascade Mountains, we see these very patchy environments where we see a lot of brown representing high deserts interspersed among some of these cold mountain ranges. Put that into context of things like precipitation and temperature. Those brown high desert areas, of course, have low precipitation shown here in red and high temperatures as compared to these blue areas that show those regions of where the cold mountain ranges exist. And the main reason of showing you these satellite images and so forth of the interior Columbia Basin is to demonstrate that fish that occupy these areas already encounter some very challenging environments. And so under scenarios of climate change, we may expect those limits to be pushed and those challenges to become even greater. And so there's been a fairly extensive amount of climate change and habitat modeling work being done. David and Bob just showed you some examples of that. Here I'm showing some habitat work that was modeled by Seth Wenger. And here he's showing essentially the habitat suitability for a variety of trout species is expected to decrease over time. And if one of the general summaries of that work is to show that habitat suitability is expected to decline by about 50% by 2080 under some of these climate change scenarios. And so when we think about fish in these scenarios, if habitat becomes unsuitable for them, they have fairly limited options. One of the first options might be to move or alter their distribution into different thermal regimes. However, many of these fish species that we're talking about in this area have very limited potential to distribute to other areas. This may be due to barriers, either natural or man-made. So if they can't move, there are very real scenarios where populations or certain segments of species may become locally extirpated. But I also want to explore this idea of the potential for species to adapt. And when I mean adapt, I mean some portion of the species, some segment of the species may be able to survive and evolve to the new conditions. And so if we're talking about the potential for adaptation within a species, we can think about a trait such as upper thermal tolerance in these fishes. And if we look at a curve representing the diversity of thermal tolerance across the species, we'll see that in this example they have a mean around 25 degrees Celsius. But some portion of the species have a thermal tolerance that's greater than that. And so with this broad level of diversity, that means if some segment of the population or species experiences these warmer water temperatures, directional selection may shift the thermal tolerance of that segment to tolerate those warmer environments. And that's only under a scenario where there's a broad variation to begin with. And I wanted to contrast that with a scenario where if the initial diversity was where there's very narrow diversity in that species, where essentially none of the individuals under that curve have a thermal tolerance that could tolerate this warmer water temperature, that's a scenario where we'd expect the majority of that species or that segment of that species to be extirpated from that region. And so this idea about how much diversity is within that initial species is an important concept to consider. And then I have to bring up this concept about velocity of climate change versus the rate of evolution. It's been shown that stream slope has a dominant influence on the velocity of climate change, where there's expected to be rapid velocity of climate change for lower slope streams. So for fish, this means that some of these fish populations at lower elevations are likely to be the first and most heavily impacted by climate warming. And some of these fish are expected to have fairly limited dispersal opportunities. So the question really is, can fish evolve at a rate to keep up with the velocity of climate change? And so I put this question in context of some of the native trout species of concern in the Pacific Northwest. Here I'm showing bull trout and cutthroat trout and red band trout and their elevation profile where these species typically occupy. Bull trout and cutthroat typically are occupying some of these very cold headwater streams. And there are definitely some concerns regarding climate change for these fish, such as fragmentation and isolation of some of these populations. But it's species like red band trout that are at these lower elevations that are expected to have this high velocity of climate change and be some of the first that are most dramatically impacted. And this is a species that has particularly limited dispersal potential. And so I'm going to focus now on some of the work we've done on red band trout that are native to the interior portion of the Columbia Basin. So this is the native form of the species in the interior that occupies these very diverse environments. And this is a particularly compelling subspecies to study because they do currently occupy both desert and montane streams, where some of these desert stream temperatures have been shown to reach up to about 30 degrees Celsius in the summertime. So this is a very warm temperature exceeding much of the thermal tolerance that's expected for the species range. And so this provides us the opportunity to investigate the potential for adaptation that's already occurred in some of these species throughout this range. And if we think about and look at some of the habitat differences between desert and montane streams, we see that desert streams have been shown to have significantly higher summer water temperatures, less shade, lower elevation, lower gradient, and less large substrate than the montane streams. And particularly if we focus on this idea about higher water temperatures, we have to think about what happens in those warmer waters. Essentially, one of the main limiting factors is that there's less oxygen in warm water. This is just a physical property of water, whereas temperature increases, as shown on this graph on the bottom, the concentration of oxygen decreases. And so when fish find themselves in warm water, they have some adaptive capacity. Previous work has shown that, in general, fish will increase their heart rate to deliver more oxygen to those tissues. So that heart really starts pumping to try and deliver more oxygen to feed the tissues that need that oxygen to maintain themselves. And so in order to investigate the scenarios of potential for adaptation within red band trout, a few years ago we went into some of these typical montane streams and typical desert streams and surveyed some red band trout in these different areas. So here this region shows us the montane streams that we surveyed in the desert from southwest Idaho area. And what we were able to do by surveying these 12 populations in this initial study was identify populations that were kind of at the extreme range of adaptation here. And so if we look at the desert streams, we found one population in particular that was the most warm adapted and enabled us to do more intensive investigation using that population. But for comparison, we also wanted a typical montane stream. So we used these fish from this Keithley Creek stream. And then we also found a population that was occupying this extremely cold environment that we believe to be fairly cold adapted. But today I'm going to be focusing on some of the results of the intensive work that we've done between these populations. You'll see them in some of the slides represented, this desert population in red and the montane in blue for many of the slides. You remember I mentioned that fish will often increase their heart rate in warmer temperature regime. So we had a PhD student from University of British Columbia working with us on this project, and he was measuring the heart rate of a sample of fish as temperature increases. And indeed, you see this graph here shows us for the montane fish we have an increasing heart rate as temperature increases. However, you see at some point it plateaus and then it stops here, and that stopping point is essentially when this fish experienced heart arrhythmia, or essentially irregular heartbeats. This is in contrast to the desert fish, those from that warm adapted population from Little Jack's Creek that I mentioned. And here you see not only is there that trend of increasing heart rate, but at those higher temperatures they have significantly higher heart rates, so they're delivering more oxygen to the tissues, but also that arrhythmia time point is at a higher temperature, around 28 degrees Celsius. However, you note that there is still that limitation. And then what we're also able to do is create hybrids between these two that show that intermediate signal. So with this data set, we're able to really identify that fish in these desert environments over time have evolved a higher heart rate to deliver more oxygen to their tissues, but there is a limit, and that's something that's important to keep in mind. We are also interested in looking at the stress response of these fish under warmer water temperatures, and so we looked at a particular class of genes known as heat shock proteins, and these are essentially, you can think of them as a stress response gene. And what this graph is showing us is the stress response of our desert strain or montane strain, and then the hybrids relative to fish that were held at control temperatures where they experienced no stress. So this zero line would be no stress, and what you can infer is that over time, all three of the strains appear to acclimate to some degree and have a fairly limited amount of stress. But at that first exposure to stress, or exposure to the warm waters, the desert strain was much less stressed than the montane fish, and the hybrids again were intermediate to those, again suggesting that fish in those desert environments have evolved an adaptive heat shock response and essentially are less stressed. And so this is important when you think about some of the long-term survival advantages. And in this particular experiment, we also noticed evidence for differential survival. And so we're interested in trying to understand in general what genes are being expressed or controlled that allow some of these desert fish to survive long-term under exposure to heat stress, and we found overall they have a very distinct expression pattern when we look across the entire transcriptome, which represents roughly 24,000 genes for this species. And it's these very different expression patterns that have a genetic basis that are providing this long-term survival advantage. And so this suggests there's a genetic basis for this thermal adaptation that's occurred. And indeed, when we look at DNA markers, so in this case we looked at around 10,000, a little over 10,000 I guess here, what are known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. It's a class of DNA markers, and what's represented here is each one of these dots represents one of the SNP markers, and those above this red dashed line in green are DNA markers that were significantly associated with survival under heat stress. And the great thing about this is that DNA markers are a very efficient tool that allows us to screen very broadly across many individuals or populations, and I'll get back to that point in just a few slides. To quickly summarize the results of adaptation we saw in these red band trout, we saw that the response to heat stress is heritable and has a genetic basis. We saw fish in the desert stream delivered more oxygen to their tissues and were less stressed in general. And this suggested an evolutionary adaptation to heat stress in order to provide a long-term survival advantage in this species. And so this example with red band trout generally indicates that adaptation from existing genetic variation is possible, but this is dependent on how much diversity is present. So in this case, there was adequate genetic diversity present, and I suggest that you think back to some of those curves where it was representing broad diversity. This is a species where indeed we found broad diversity in the species, which allowed them to adapt to these desert environments. However, I also wanted to again emphasize that there is a limit to adaptation within that species from existing diversity. And as we think about scenarios of climate change is going to push those limits even further, particularly for some of those desert populations and maybe for some of these other populations throughout their species range. And then one of my last slides here, I wanted to point out some of the long-term objectives for this ongoing study is to utilize some of the DNA markers that we found that are significantly associated with thermal adaptation that allow us to broadly screen throughout this species range. And that's this map here on the bottom shows us the Columbia River Basin, and each of the blue dots indicates a population of this species where they occur. And so we started to begin to screen these DNA markers to determine the potential for adaptation and what the vulnerability is of these specific populations under scenarios of climate change. And that help us manage and place conservation priorities on certain regions and certain areas, and also direct habitat restoration efforts. And so with this in mind, for not only for this species, but then we want to apply this approach fairly broadly to other species in the Columbia River. We heard a lot about salmon, which is certainly a priority that we want to move to next, as well as considering lamprey and sturgeon. And then just briefly, I want to acknowledge a variety of people that have been involved in these studies in our laboratory. So there's a lot of field sampling that's involved in getting our hands on these fish from these fairly extreme environments, culturing some of these fish in our wet lab environment, completing some of the physiology experiments that I discussed, and then collecting the genetics data from our genetics lab. And then lastly, funding from this I wanted to point out is from the Bonneville Power Administration. And that's essentially all I have for everyone today. I'll open it up to questions now, and these questions of course are not only just for me, but I think this question session, as Sue will moderate, is for everyone in the session that's talked before me, David and Bob also.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean. And we already have some questions, and I'll just go ahead and start reading through them. The first one, this is for you, David. At the end of your presentation, you talked about upcoming research that you're doing on lamprey and one other organism, and this person did not catch what the other organism was.
Okay, sure. Sorry, I went pretty fast there at the end. That's Eulicon. They're also known as candlefish. They're a smelt populations exist in the eastern Pacific.
Okay.
So again, that's Eulicon.
Eulicon. Okay, thank you. The next question, does the hydropower drawdown include drafts for chum?
Yes, this is Bob Heineth, and we have scenarios that look at different flow ranges for chum, both the current condition and then some that don't look at providing any extra flow for chum, and then some middle range ones. So yes, we were looking at a number of different scenarios around that issue.
Okay, thank you. The next question, have any of your analyses or strategies considered direct and indirect effects on human health?
No, this is Bob Heine. Not directly, although we are looking, it's associated with the overall health of the population, I guess, and because salmon are such a critical tribal resource, and tribal folks eat a lot of salmon, certainly being able to hang on to productivity is going to be important to the overall health of tribes. So I would say probably indirectly, yes.
Okay, thank you. Next question, regarding the fish survival graphs of Macon shown by Bob, is the data, is the data due to temperature, or does it include all effects such as predation, disease, toxics, etc.? Please comment.
Those survival, the McCann graphs, yes, that is all the factors that influence salmon survival as those fish migrate downstream through the river and out into the ocean and return as adults. So it's every parameter that those fish encounter during that migration life history stage.
Okay, the next question is for Sean. Are there fish species in the Columbia River Basin water system that might benefit from global warming or climate change? If so, what are they?
There's certainly invasive species that have been introduced into the Columbia River system that probably benefit, but I think for the most part our major concerns are for native species, and those are fish species that have evolved to the current temperature regimes throughout the Columbia Basin. So there are very few scenarios that have been suggested that would be of benefit to the native species under climate change.
Okay, and then a comment. I know of no fish species more adaptable than the anadromous. Their current life cycle requires them to be very adaptable to survive, which they have done for longer than stories have been told. Herein, just like Rocky, I hold hope. Comments?
Absolutely. I would agree that salmon and many of these fish species have been around for millions of years and have been able to adapt to some of these conditions that they've been put under. And one of the things that I tried to bring up was this idea about the velocity of climate change and how quickly that might occur versus what the potential rate of evolution might be for some of these species. And it's really some uncertainty there about how quickly some of these species, particularly the native ones, may be able to adapt if climate change is occurring very quickly. So those are some uncertainties that are out there, but I would agree that in general, most of these species we're talking about have had the capacity to evolve and to adapt to their conditions over millions of years.
Yeah, this is Bob. I might add as well, anadromous fish have a series of difficult challenges because they occupy so many different habitats. So for example, we know that the ocean is becoming more acidic, and there's likely going to be large changes to biotic assemblages in the ocean, and that might affect prey and food sources for salmon. So it's very, very complex for anadromous fish. And then we're looking at, and in the river system, it's going to be important that we try to maintain patches or areas of thermal refugia so that fish have some areas that they can go to get relief from the warmer temperatures that we're expecting under climate change.
Okay, the next question is, will there be any lamprey studies for responses and possible adaptation to climate change?
Hi, this is David. There are two studies that I know of that are funded both by the North Pacific Landscape Cooperative and the Northwest Climate Science Center. There's the one we're doing here at CRITFC, looking at some coupled projections on lamprey, looking at both ocean and freshwater conditions. And there's also another one with Yakima staff, and I think some members of academia that are looking at lamprey and climate change too. One of the challenges we're finding is that there's not a lot of lamprey data. Salmon and steelhead are really intensively monitored in the Columbia Basin, and that hasn't been the case with lamprey. So we're trying to pull together what we can and take a look at some climate change scenarios with lamprey. And results, I think, of both studies will probably be out in about a year on those.
Okay, thank you. Regarding ecosystem scenarios, are you using developed models, and what are they, or are you more so developing a model? Who are you collaborating with on this?
This is Bob. We're using developed models, but we're also integrating those models within our larger framework, our CRITFC information system. And we're collaborating with, boy, a whole bunch of different folks. The Northwest Power Planning Council, Bonneville Power, Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, folks at Portland State University and the University of Washington, both the Climate Impacts Group and the Land Surface Hydrology Group. So we're collaborating throughout the region and also doing some collaboration with the Canadians and some of the folks at some of the National Atmospheric Center and Oak Ridge and elsewhere. So yes, we're doing a lot of collaboration and we're using existing models and adapting them into our overall CIS system.
Okay. Are there any scenarios that include dam removal?
No, there aren't any scenarios that look at dam removal. We are looking at fish passage reintroduction over high-head dams such as Grand Coulee, but nothing specific in terms of removing any dams in our scenario at this point.
Okay. Sean showed a slide that was a hybrid between the cold and warm adapted red band trout. Was this hybrid produced in the lab, or is it natural? If laboratory bred, does this imply a strategy of human intervention is being considered?
Right, so this is Sean. Some of those slides, the experiments that we carried out were here in a wet lab environment, so we wanted to have controlled conditions and be able to directly compare the pure strains to a scenario where if there was the hybrid and how that related to the pure strains. And so those were created here by collecting gametes from the two pure strains and crossing them in a hatchery type environment. These populations of red band trout are generally fairly isolated from one another. Historically, there may have been more connected than they are now, where they had the opportunity to interbreed on a regular basis. But I would anticipate historically they were also fairly isolated just because of the environments that they occupy. I think there's all kinds of scenarios that would potentially lead to what future strategies would be for conservation efforts, particularly for some of these populations as we start to determine if there are some groups throughout the Columbia River Basin that are highly vulnerable to extinction or extirpation under scenarios of climate change. Then there could be some actions taken that may be introducing some variability that may not have been there currently. There's a variety of scenarios that exist.
Okay, a question, let's see, regarding total precipitation, how is it projected to change?
That's a really good question. We just attended a release, some of the most recent general circulation models, which is called CMIP-5 that Bob mentioned. And so there's actually several models that are run on a global basis, and then there are efforts in the Northwest to downscale these because the general circulation models are pretty coarse and they don't incorporate a lot of the local fine-scale features like our mountainous terrain. But in general, most of the models were showing an overall increase in the future in precipitation in the Northwest in varying degrees. But seasonally, this increase occurred more in the fall, winter, and spring, and the summers were actually looking a little drier. But overall, there was an overall precipitation increase on an annual basis.
Okay, and we're going to do one last question because we're basically out of time. Could dams become a benefit for use in reducing the impact of temperature increase?
Yes, this is Bob. Absolutely. That was the point of one of those last slides I showed of those two dams, that they have low-level outlets constructed at the bottom of them, so they can be used to selectively pull cool water out of the bottom of the reservoirs that occurs due to warming and so forth of the surface areas of the reservoirs, and the cool water sinks to the bottom. So yes, it can be used definitely as an adaptation tool, and in fact, in the case of Dvorak Dam, it's already being used to cool down main stem water in the Snake River.
Okay, well, we had a bunch of really great questions. Thank you, everyone, for posing the questions, and to the presenters for answering them. I want to thank David, Bob, and Sean for joining us and giving the presentations. Really interesting and informative. I just want to remind people that we have recorded this webinar, and we will be posting the webinar and the presentations on ITEP's Climate Change webinar webpage. It may take a week or two for them to be up on the website. And also a reminder that we have another webinar on Wednesday this week. Kathy Lynn and me presenting about some funding opportunities and resources that are available for adaptation planning. So with that, we will close the webinar, and hopefully you'll join us on Wednesday. Thank you. Bye-bye.